The evening air was cool, the kind of autumn night that made the small American town glow with an almost cinematic charm. The streets were alive with the sounds of laughter, the shuffle of footsteps on the sidewalk, and the faint strains of jazz spilling from a bar a block away. In the center of town stood a restaurant everyone knew, its windows glowing golden against the darkening sky. Inside, glasses clinked, forks scraped plates, and wealthy couples leaned toward each other over candlelit tables, their voices low and carefree. To anyone passing by, it looked like the very picture of comfort and belonging. But for the man standing outside, staring at his own reflection in the glass door, it was something else entirely. He was a veteran, middle-aged, his jacket worn thin at the elbows, his boots scuffed from years of use. His face was lined, not just with age, but with the kind of experiences that etch themselves into the soul, the long nights in foreign deserts, the dust storms that blinded and burned, the faces of comrades who never came home. He had survived all of that, and yet tonight he stood paralyzed before a door, unsure whether he belonged on the other side. His hand hovered on the handle for a moment. Hunger gnawed at him. He hadn't eaten properly all day, but it wasn't only hunger that pushed him forward. It was the longing for something simpler, something normal. He wanted to sit at a table, order a meal, and be treated like any other man. He wanted to feel, just for an hour, that he was home, that he was part of the world he had given so much to protect. He pulled the door open, and warmth enveloped him immediately. The smell of garlic butter and roasted steak, the hum of conversation, the soft light bouncing off polished wood and glass. For a brief moment, his heart lifted. Maybe this would be all right. Maybe he could fade into the background, just another customer. He approached the host stand. A young woman in a crisp uniform looked up, her smile automatic, until her eyes settled on him. It faltered, just slightly, but enough for him to notice. She scanned his clothes, his boots, the tired lines around his eyes. Something hardened in her expression. "Good evening," she said, her tone polite but cool. "Do you have a reservation?" He cleared his throat. "No, ma'am. Just a table for one." His voice carried the gravel of years spent shouting over helicopters and explosions, though he tried to keep it soft, steady. Her smile tightened. "I'm sorry, sir. We're very busy tonight. Without a reservation?" She let the words hang. He glanced over her shoulder. Half the tables were empty, candles flickering on untouched linens. He looked back at her. "I don't mind waiting. I just want a meal." The hostess shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting toward the dining room where well-dressed patrons laughed over glasses of wine. She lowered her voice. "Sir, this might not be the right place for you." His chest tightened. "The right place?" "This restaurant has a certain atmosphere," she said quickly, as though reciting something she had been told. "We try to maintain a standard for our guests. Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere else." Her words cut deeper than any bullet ever had. He had been shot at, shelled, ambushed in the dead of night. But never had he felt so small, so dismissed, so utterly unseen. He felt the eyes of the diners on him now, curiosity sparking in their glances, then disdain. A man in a tailored suit whispered something to his companion, and they both chuckled. A woman in pearls sipped her wine, her gaze lingering on him as if he were an inconvenience that had disturbed her evening. "I can pay," he said, his hand instinctively reaching toward his pocket. He had a $20 bill folded there, enough for something simple, nothing fancy. But the hostess shook her head, her smile gone now, replaced with thin impatience. "It's not about the money," she said firmly. "We reserve the right to refuse service. Please, sir, don't make this difficult. The word echoed in his ears. Difficult was crouching in a ditch while mortars exploded overhead. Difficult was carrying a bleeding friend across open ground with bullets snapping past. Difficult was living through war only to return home to indifference. This was humiliation. And yet, he could do nothing. Slowly, he turned. Each step toward the door felt heavier, as though his boots were filled with lead. The laughter behind him grew louder, crueler, or perhaps it was only in his mind. He pushed open the door and stepped back into the cool night air. It closed behind him with a soft click, a sound that felt final, like a lock turning. He stood on the sidewalk, staring at the ground, his hands trembling. The 20 in his pocket burned against his thigh. He had money, he had served, he had bled, and still he was turned away, like a beggar. Memories rushed in without warning, the dust of foreign roads, the cries of comrades, the flag-draped coffins lowered into the earth. He had fought for this country, for the people inside that restaurant, for their right to laugh and dine in peace. And yet, here he was, excluded, invisible, forgotten. A passerby brushed against him, muttered, "Watch it," and moved on without a glance. The veteran straightened his shoulders, tried to breathe. He told himself it didn't matter. It was only a meal. But deep inside, something cracked. The sense of belonging he had clung to since coming home shattered into pieces. For the first time, he felt truly abandoned. Not by the enemy he had fought overseas, but by the very people he had sworn to protect. As he stood on the sidewalk outside the glowing restaurant, the laughter muffled behind the glass, his mind slipped backward. The night air faded, the streets of his hometown dissolved, and once again he was there, half a world away in the blistering desert where every breath tasted of dust and fear. He remembered the heat first. It was a merciless thing, pressing down from the sky and radiating up from the sand until it felt like his very bones were cooking. The body armor strapped tight across his chest trapped every drop of sweat, soaking him until his shirt clung to his skin. His rifle weighed heavy in his hands, an extension of his body, something he clutched not out of choice, but necessity. Around him, the other soldiers trudged forward, their faces streaked with grit, their eyes scanning the horizon with a focus that came from knowing death could spring from any shadow. The first patrol was burned into his memory. The village road stretched before them, lined with crumbling walls and doorways too dark to read. Children peeked out, their expressions impossible to decipher. Was it curiosity, fear, or something else? He had kept his finger close to the trigger, his heart pounding, each step louder in his ears than the last. And then, in an instant, the world exploded. The blast ripped through the lead vehicle, shattering the quiet. The air filled with fire and dust, the shock waves slamming into him, knocking the breath from his lungs. His ears rang, a high-pitched scream that drowned out everything else. He hit the ground, disoriented, vision blurred, tasting grit and smoke. Shouts cut through the ringing, orders, cries for help, the chaos of men scrambling to survive. He looked up and saw his friend, a kid barely 20, his body broken by shrapnel, his eyes staring wide at the sky. That was the first life he saw slip away, and it never left him. The missions blurred after that, but each carried its own scars. There were the long nights under foreign stars, lying awake with his rifle across his chest, listening for footsteps in the dark. There were the sudden bursts of gunfire, the sharp cracks that sent adrenaline surging through his veins. There were the ambushes, the narrow escapes, the close calls when a single second meant the difference between life and death. But amid the horror, there was also brotherhood. He remembered the laughter around makeshift fires, the jokes traded in whispers so as not to draw attention. A soldier from Texas taught everyone poker with a battered deck of cards. A quiet kid from Ohio had a voice like an angel, singing softly to calm their nerves in the dead of night. Those small moments kept them human, reminding them that beyond the war, beyond the dust and blood, they were still men with dreams, with families, with lives waiting back home. And yet, the battlefield never let them forget what was at stake. He remembered the ambush at dusk, the way the horizon burned with the last light of day. The silence had been too thick, too heavy, and his gut had clenched with warning. Then the world erupted. Gunfire rained down from rooftops, Bullets sparking against metal, men shouting, ducking for cover. He had fired until his arms ached, until his throat was raw, dragging a wounded comrade behind a wall, pressing his hands against a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. When it was over, the ground was littered with shell casings, the air choking with smoke. He looked down at his hands, blood smeared across them, and realized some stains never wash away. He thought of the letters too. Late nights in the barracks, scribbling words under the dim glow of a flashlight. Promises to loved ones. I'm safe. I'll be home soon. Lies meant to comfort, even when danger lurked at every turn. He mailed them when he could, knowing some would never reach their destination. He carried the replies close to his heart, folded and worn, reminders of the world he was fighting for. But the hardest memories were the losses. He could still see their faces. The boy from Georgia with the crooked smile, the sergeant who always carried extra candy to hand out to local kids, the medic who patched up wounds with hands steady even under fire. One by one, they were taken, swallowed by the war, their names added to lists that grew too long. Each time the unit marched on, but something inside them broke. By the end, he felt like a hollow version of himself, carrying pieces of everyone he had lost. Even now, years later, back in his hometown, those memories clung to him. The battlefield wasn't behind him, it lived in him. Every loud noise, every sudden movement, every quiet night was enough to pull him back. He had left the desert, but the desert had not left him. Standing outside the restaurant, humiliated and alone, he realized the rejection hurt so deeply because it reminded him of those sacrifices. He had given so much time, blood, pieces of his soul for the people who sat comfortably inside, laughing, eating, safe. And yet, when he reached for the simplest thing, a meal, he was cast aside. The ghosts of his past whispered in that moment, the faces of the fallen, the voices of brothers who would never come home. He clenched his jaw, blinking back the sting in his eyes. If their sacrifices had meant anything, then he could not let this defeat define him. The battlefield had shaped him, scarred him, broken him, but it had also given him something no one could take, the will to survive. The roar of the engines still rang in his ears when the plane touched down on American soil. For a moment, the entire cabin had gone quiet, as though every soldier on board held their breath, waiting for the wheels to truly meet the ground. When the jolt came, when the metal screeched against the runway, a ripple went through them. Relief, disbelief, even joy. He pressed his forehead against the small oval window, staring at the familiar landscape below, and whispered to himself, I made it. As they disembarked, the air felt different, cooler, cleaner, full of scents he had nearly forgotten. Fresh grass, rain-soaked pavement, the faint sweetness of autumn. It struck him harder than he expected. For years, the only air he'd known carried dust, smoke, and the bitter sting of gunpowder. Now, standing on his homeland again, he inhaled like a drowning man reaching the surface. The terminal was chaos. Families pressed against barricades, waving signs and flags, their voices rising in cheers. Children sat on shoulders, holding up posters scrawled with "Welcome home" and "We missed you." The sound washed over him, shouts, laughter, sobs, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of something good pressing on his chest. He scanned the crowd, and then he saw them. His mother, her hair grayer than when he left, her arms already open. His sister, crying openly, waving frantically as though she feared he might miss her. He moved toward them, his boots clattering on the tile, his duffel bag heavy but forgotten. When his mother's arms wrapped around him, it was as if the years fell away. She smelled of home, lavender soap, warm bread, something safe. You're here, she whispered, her voice cracking, and he held her tighter. His sister buried her face against his shoulder, sobbing, repeating over and over, You're safe now. You're safe. For a moment, he let himself believe it. He was safe. He was home. The first days were a blur of reunions. Old friends stopped by, neighbours dropped off pies, strangers shook his hand in grocery store aisles, thanking him for his service. At church, the congregation stood and clapped as he walked in, the pastor praising his sacrifice. He smiled, nodded, said the words he was expected to say. "Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm glad to be home." Each repetition felt like a script, comforting at first, then hollow. He tried to slip back into the rhythm of civilian life. He sat at his mother's kitchen table, the same one where he had eaten cereal as a boy, listening to the refrigerator hum, the clock tick. The ordinary sounds should have soothed him, but instead, they unsettled him. The silence was too fragile, like glass that might shatter at any moment. When a car backfired outside, he flinched so hard his coffee spilled. His mother reached for his hand, worry etched in her eyes, but he forced a smile. "Just not used to the quiet," he said. At night, he lay in his childhood bedroom, the posters still on the walls, the same bedspread he had left behind. He stared at the ceiling in the dark, waiting for sleep that never came. When it did, it betrayed him with nightmares, sand, fire, voices calling for help that never came. He woke drenched in sweat, his chest heaving, whispering to himself, "You're home. You're safe. You're home." The words felt fragile, powerless against the ghosts that followed him. Friends asked questions he couldn't answer. What was it like over there? They wanted stories, details, something to satisfy their curiosity. He never knew what to say. How could he explain the stench of burning metal, the weight of carrying a man bleeding out in his arms, the silence after a firefight when the world seemed broken? How could he compress years of fear, courage, and loss into words that wouldn't scar the listener? Usually, he just said, "It was tough," and let the conversation drift. They nodded, satisfied, and he carried the weight alone. Still, there were moments of joy. He walked through the park where he had played as a boy, children running past him with kites and ice cream. He visited the diner he'd once loved, though it felt smaller now, the burgers less magical. He met old friends at the bar, laughing with them, though the laughter never reached his eyes. For them, nothing had changed. For him, everything had. The hardest part was purpose. In the military, every day had been defined. Missions, schedules, orders. At home, the days stretched open, wide and uncertain. He woke without alarms, moved without commands, drifted through hours that seemed endless. Freedom, they called it. To him, it felt like floating without anchor. He tried to find work. Applications asked for skills he didn't have. Degrees, certifications, office experience. He explained his service. Leadership, crisis management, logistics. Interviewers nodded politely, then asked about spreadsheets, software, sales quotas. He walked out of each interview knowing he wouldn't get the call. And then there were the thank yous. At first, they warmed him. The cashier, the pharmacist, the stranger on the street. But soon they felt rehearsed, mechanical. People said the words, but their eyes slid past him, already moving on. "Thank you for your service." Became less about him and more about them, a phrase to ease guilt, to perform politeness. He wanted to ask, "Do you know what that service cost? Do you know what I carry?" But he never did. He just nodded, forced a smile, and walked away. In the quiet moments, doubt crept in. He thought of his brothers overseas, the ones who hadn't come back. He saw their faces when he closed his eyes. He heard their jokes, their plans, their last words. Survivor's guilt, they called it. But names didn't make it lighter. Why him? Why was he here, sitting at a kitchen table, while they lay under foreign soil or in flag-draped coffins? The hometown he once loved felt foreign. He walked its streets and saw ghosts, himself as a boy riding a bike, himself as a teenager holding hands with a girl, himself as a young man dreaming of the future. Those ghosts seemed brighter, freer, unscarred. He envied them. He wanted to step into their shoes, to feel that innocence again. but he couldn't. And still, there were flickers of hope. A child saluted him once in the grocery store, clumsy but earnest. A neighbor left a note on his porch. "We're glad you're back." An old friend raised a glass at the bar and said, "You're still the same guy to us. That's all that matters." These moments mattered, however small. They reminded him that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to belong again. But as the weeks turned into months, he began to realize the hardest truth. Coming home was not the same as being home. He had returned, yes, but the man who had left years ago was not the man who stood here now, and the world he had fought to protect had moved on without him. At first, he tried to trick himself into believing that routine would save him. He set alarms even when he had nowhere to be, shaved with careful patience, brewed coffee he didn't always finish, and stood at the window long enough to watch the street wake up. Delivery trucks hissing to a stop, dog walkers in hoodies, joggers with earbuds, and that distant look of people already inside their own day. He told himself that motion was progress, that if he kept moving forward, the past would stop nipping at his heels. But motion without a destination is just circling, and after a while, he felt the orbit tighten, the same corners of town, the same conversations, the same politely closed doors. He needed work, not just for the money, though the stack of bills by the toaster had begun to look like a dare, but for the anchor of purpose. In uniform, purpose had been issued with the gear. Here's your mission. Here's your map. Here's the man on your left and the man on your right. Don't let either of them down. In the civilian world, purpose hid behind HR portals and bullet points that spoke a language he hadn't learned. He listed what he knew: leading people under stress, planning logistics under fire, improvising with too little time and too few resources. The interviewers nodded with the kind of sympathy that says, impressive and irrelevant in the same breath. "We're really looking for someone with 3 years of CRM administration," one said, apologetic as a doctor delivering bad news. Another smiled thinly. "Your leadership background is strong, but we need familiarity with our specific tool stack." He walked home with the weight of invisible medals tugging at his pockets. Construction seemed honest, work that paid you in sweat and sore hands, the kind of tired that doesn't argue when your head hits the pillow. He liked the smell of cut lumber, the austere logic of a squared frame, and a true line. But bodies remember before minds do, and his flinches made co-workers stare. A dropped bundle of rebar cracked like a shot. He was ducking behind a pallet before he could stop himself. The foreman, a man with forearms like hammers, called him into the trailer and spoke gently enough to hurt. "You're a hard worker," he said, eyes on a clipboard that didn't need reading. "But this site is loud." The pause did the work of all the words he didn't want to say. He nodded, shook hands, and carried his lunch pail home the way a man carries a flag he can't fly. Nights stretched, thin and brittle. The apartment had the faint chemical scent of fresh paint and someone else's life scrubbed away. He tried the TV, but the canned laughter felt like a joke he had never been told, and crime dramas made his chest tighten in ways that weren't entertainment. He cooked simple meals and left half of them uneaten. He taped blackout liners behind the blinds and still woke at 3:17, heart pounding, lungs braced for a dust he couldn't inhale. The therapists called it hypervigilance, which sounded like a skill until it started erasing him. He could hear the neighbor's keys at the lock like a riffle of dominoes. He could map the building's plumbing by the way water rushed in the walls. Every slam was a breach, every siren an incoming. He kept a glass of water by the bed and a pair of boots by the door because soles against flooring felt like control. The VA waiting room taught patience and fraternity in equal measure. Men and women sat with the posture of people who had learned to endure. Paperwork moved through the building like a river in drought. Slow, silty, inevitable. He traded small talk that wasn't small at all. Favorite chow hall lies, worst MRES, the jokes you use to keep your throat from closing. In a fluorescent lit group, he listened to a Marine describe waking on the kitchen floor with a skillet still warm, To an army medic, explain why fireworks in July made him watch the exits. When it was his turn, he spoke about the restaurant, about the way a hand lifted in refusal can feel like a weapon if you've been hit enough times. There were nods around the circle that said, "Without ceremony, we get it." He left with a pamphlet and a follow-up appointment and that rare commodity, the sense that not everything he carried was unspeakable. But outside, the world did not adjust its pace. Banks wanted payments. Landlords wanted checks. A red notice arrived in the mail like a slap disguised as a rectangle. He did the math twice, then a third time, as if numbers might change under pressure. Pride was a stubborn friend, but hunger is persuasive. So he took shifts where he could, stocking a grocery store at 4 a.m., unloading trucks in the cold breath of the loading dock, delivering takeout in a car whose check engine light was a companion more loyal than it should have been. He learned the geography of other people's comforts, the cul-de-sacs with synced lawn services, the apartment towers with mailrooms nicer than his kitchen. And he learned how to appear and disappear with the bag at the door, a ghost paid by the mile. Small mercies came dressed as routine. An older clerk at the grocery store set aside bruised produce she couldn't sell. A barista slid him a coffee on the house when she had to remake someone's drink. The guy at the auto shop topped off his fluids and looked away from the invoice. These weren't rescues, they were stitches. You don't fix a life with stitches, but you can keep it from bleeding out. On Sundays, he walked to the river and followed the trail until town thinned into scrub and the water carried bigger sky. The rhythm steadied him. Footfall, breath, the modest applause of wind in cottonwoods. He talked to himself out there, the way people do when they're trying to line up the furniture in their minds. He rehearsed versions of the future. Maybe he'd learn a trade the body could tolerate. Wiring, maybe. Something with rules you can touch. Maybe he'd take night classes and wrangle the acronyms that had kept him from the desk jobs. Maybe he'd stop defining success as a single door that refused to open and start building a hallway of his own. But the town had long memories for gossip and short ones for grace. The restaurant incident clung to him, like the smell of grease after a shift. He caught whispers. That guy, the tilt of a chin, the soft cruelty of certainty in people who weren't there. It would have been easier to leave, to fold his life into boxes and chase anonymity someplace with a bigger skyline. Instead, stubbornness rooted him. This was his town too. He had learned to hold ground under worse conditions. He tried dating once, a coffee meetup arranged by a friend of a friend who told him softly, "She's kind and she likes hikers." She was kind, and she did hike, and for 40 minutes they talked about trails and dogs and the best burger within 40 miles. Then she asked the question that made his forked road visible. "So, what do you do?" He told the truth in two versions: the past, what he'd done, and the present, what he was trying to do. She smiled with empathy he appreciated and boundaries he respected. "You're rebuilding," she said. "That's brave." They parted with genuine warmth. On the walk home, he realized that bravery had started feeling like a word people used when they didn't know what else to say. Bills forced another pivot. He sold a few things that had once felt non-negotiable: a guitar, the good winter coat, kept the medals in the drawer where they couldn't be pawned and couldn't help. He cut cable, cut subscriptions, cut excuses. An idea began to nag at him with the persistence of a song stuck in his head. If doors won't open, make a door. Every job he tried had a gatekeeper. Every gatekeeper had a script. What if he wrote a script of his own? He thought of the quiet steadiness he'd found in the construction site before the reflexes tangled him. He thought of the small diner he frequented as a teenager, where the owner knew everyone's order by the way they pushed open the door. He thought of food not as cuisine but as hospitality, the universal language for you belong here. He started small, not with a lease or a loan he couldn't service, but with a notebook and a kitchen timer. He tested recipes at odd hours, chasing honest flavors that didn't need showing off. Chili that tasted like winter football games. Biscuits like the ones the church ladies used to bring to potlucks. Coffee you could drink black and call it a friend. He took notes like an NCO building a plan. Ingredients, costs, prep time, Yield. He asked the clerk with the kind eyes to price out bulk orders. He shadowed the night manager at the grocery store to understand supply rhythms. He watched people where they gathered, ball fields, shifts changing, Sunday services, and learned when hunger and schedule shook hands. Meanwhile, the world kept presenting tests. A kid set off fireworks in the alley, and panic elbowed his lungs. He talked himself down with the same calm he once used on a radio under fire. Assess, breathe, decide. A delivery job sent him to the restaurant that had turned him away, and he stood on the sidewalk with a paper bag warming his palm, staring at the glow behind the glass. He handed the food to a man in a vest who didn't meet his eyes and told himself that resentment is a currency that never makes you rich. He walked away before the old ache could turn fresh. Piece by piece, he built a day that didn't collapse under its own weight. Morning runs by the river when the mist still clung low. Midday batches of chili and cornbread he packaged into quart containers and sold to guys on the loading dock who didn't have time for a lunch break. Evenings spent at the VA kitchen, volunteering 2 nights a week, learning the geometry of service. How long a hello should last, where to stand so a timid person can step toward you instead of away. He listened more than he spoke. He learned the names you say softly and the topics you don't push. When someone asked why he was there, he said, "Because someone should be." There were setbacks. His car died on a night it couldn't afford to, and the tow ate 2 weeks of profits. A batch split on the stove and went to the trash, and he stood there scraping a pot, wondering if this was just another orbit in a different sky. But the next morning, an old sergeant from group therapy showed up with a used stock pot and a grin. "You gonna let a little scorch retire you?" the man asked. He laughed for the first time in days. The kind of laugh that shakes loose dust you didn't know you were carrying. What changed wasn't luck, but traction. A foreman who had once let him go hired him to cater a Friday lunch because the guys won't shut up about that chili. A church opened its fellowship hall on Saturdays if he'd feed the volunteers painting the nursery. A city clerk explained pop-up permits like a coach drawing plays on a chalkboard. He framed the forms with care, each approval a rung. At night, he still woke sometimes at 3:17. The ghosts hadn't moved out. They had learned better table manners. When they came, he let them sit a while, said their names in his head, and reminded them, and himself, that memory wasn't a cage if you leave the door open. He kept the boots by the door out of habit, but he also kept a clean apron on a hook by the stove, and some mornings that felt like armor too. He didn't tell himself a fairy tale. The town hadn't changed. The restaurant hadn't apologized. People still said, "Thank you," for your service with eyes that slid away. But they also lined up for quart containers with cash in hand, and the way a man says your name when he's hungry, and you feed him, that's a kind of gratitude that sticks. On a Tuesday that felt like a hinge, he wrote 3 words at the top of a new page in the notebook. Open. A. Place. He underlined each word once, then twice, then put the pen down like you do after signing something that matters. The struggle hadn't ended. It had evolved. He was still rebuilding, still paying down notices, still coaxing sleep into staying. But he was moving with a vector, not in a circle. And for the first time since he stepped back onto American soil, the day didn't just ask, "What do you do?" It answered back, "This." Night came differently for him than it did for most people. For his neighbors, it was a curtain that closed gently, a time to slip into bed and drift into dreams without fear. For him, it was a battlefield waiting to ambush. Darkness carried weight, and silence was never silent enough. He tried to sleep. He followed every tip the doctors and pamphlets offered. No caffeine after noon, a strict bedtime, blackout curtains drawn tight. He even bought a white noise machine, a steady hum meant to mimic peace. But none of it held the line. The moment he closed his eyes, the world he had fought so hard to leave behind came crashing back. Sometimes it began with sound. The distant crack of gunfire echoing in his skull until he could feel the vibration in his chest. Other times it was sight, the desert horizon bleeding into fire, the blur of dust kicked up by helicopters, the shapes of men moving in the shadows. Worst of all were the faces. Friends he had lost, staring at him as though demanding an answer he could never give. Their mouths opened, but no sound came, and then suddenly they screamed. He would jolt awake, drenched in sweat, the sheets twisted around him like restraints. His heart hammered against his ribs, his breathing ragged, his body convinced it was still in danger. It didn't matter that he was in a safe apartment, in a quiet town, thousands of miles from the battlefield. His body didn't know the war was over. Other nights, the dreams weren't chaotic. They were cruelly quiet. He found himself back on patrol, the desert stretching endlessly before him, the silence thick, waiting. He knew what came next. He always knew, but he couldn't stop it. The explosion tore through the air, the ground shaking, the screams filling his ears. He ran, again and again, to the same man bleeding out in the sand, pressing his hands against the wound, whispering, "Hold on, just hold on." But no matter how many times he tried, no matter how many times the dream replayed, the outcome never changed. The light faded from his friend's eyes, and he was left kneeling in the dust, helpless. Morning offered no mercy. He stumbled to the mirror, his reflection hollow-eyed, jaw clenched, the fatigue etched into every line of his face. Coffee kept him upright, but only just. He moved through the day with the weight of sleeplessness pressing on his shoulders, making every task harder, every thought slower. People noticed, at the grocery store, at odd jobs he picked up, even at church. They asked if he was okay, and he lied with a smile. Just a little tired. The truth felt too heavy to drop into casual conversation. Triggers lurked everywhere. A car backfired down the street, and he dove instinctively, his heart pounding as though bullets really were flying. Fireworks on the 4th of July sent him into a panic, the sky blooming with light that felt less like celebration and more like incoming fire. Even the smell of diesel exhaust could transport him back, his stomach twisting, his mind racing. It was as though the war had embedded itself in his senses, ready to spring out at any moment. Loneliness made it worse. Nights stretched long, the silence of his apartment filled only by the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock. He sat in the dark sometimes, staring at the door as though waiting for an enemy that would never come. He thought about calling someone, family, a friend, but what would he say? "I'm scared of the dark. I'm scared of my own mind." Instead, he bore it alone, convincing himself that silence was safer than confession. And yet, he wasn't truly alone. At the VA, he found others who carried the same scars. They spoke about their nightmares, about waking up gasping, about their families who didn't understand why sleep left them more broken than waking. One man described hearing helicopters in his dreams so vividly, he woke up on the floor, crawling for cover. Another said his nightmares weren't violent, but worse. Dreams where nothing happened, just endless waiting, the suffocating dread of what might come. Listening to them, the veteran realized he wasn't crazy. He was wounded, and wounds took time to heal. Still, there were moments when he feared he wouldn't make it. The line between dream and reality blurred too often. He found himself staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was his life now. Endless nights of sweat and panic, endless days of fatigue and pretense. He remembered something a therapist once told him. "You survived the war, but now you have to survive surviving." The words stuck because they felt cruelly accurate. But even in the depths, he clung to small anchors. The river walks, where the sound of water reminded him of something steady, something older than war. The stray dog that sometimes joined him, its quiet companionship a balm. The meals he cooked for himself, even when he had no appetite, because routine meant control. And the notebook on his table, filled with recipes and plans, a promise to himself that there could be more than this. The nightmares didn't stop, not yet. But slowly, he began to see them not only as punishment, but as reminders. Reminders of what he had endured, of what he had lost, of why he had to keep moving forward. If the war still lived inside him, then maybe he could use it, not to destroy, but to build. Maybe the ghosts could become fuel. So each morning, when he woke with sweat cooling on his skin and his heart still racing, he whispered to himself the words that had carried him through worse. Get up. Keep going. And somehow, he did. He told himself that work would be the answer. Work meant structure, and structure was something he understood. In the military, every hour of the day had been accounted for. Wake at dawn, drill, mission, eat, repeat. Civilian life, by contrast, felt like a wide open void. Days bled into each other, hours stretched without boundaries, and the silence in between gnawed at him. If he could find a job, maybe he could rebuild the scaffolding that had once held him together. The first application he submitted was to a hardware store on the edge of town. He liked the smell of sawdust, the neat rows of tools, the sense that everything had a function, a place. He wore his cleanest shirt, shook the manager's hand firmly, and answered questions as best he could. "Tell me about your previous experience," the man asked, glancing at the form. The veteran hesitated. How could he explain years spent coordinating convoys under fire, securing perimeters in hostile zones, rationing supplies so men could eat? He tried to translate. "I managed teams under high stress," he said. "I handled logistics. I made sure everyone got what they needed when they needed it." The manager nodded politely, scribbled something on the paper, and said they'd be in touch. They never called. Next, he tried construction. The work was hard, but he liked that. Hard work gave him something to wrestle with other than his mind. He showed up early, his boots laced tight, ready to prove himself. For a few days, it seemed promising. He lifted, hammered, hauled, sweat pouring down his back in a way that felt almost cleansing. But then came the sound, a metal beam crashing onto concrete. To everyone else, it was an accident, loud but harmless. To him, it was an explosion. His body reacted before his mind caught up. He dropped to the ground, covering his head, breath coming in sharp gasps. The site went quiet, men staring. Someone chuckled nervously. Someone else muttered, "What's wrong with him?" The foreman pulled him aside, kind but firm. "You're a good worker, but maybe this isn't the best fit." He left that day with his head bowed, shame burning in his chest. He tried driving deliveries. It seemed simple enough. Pick up food, drop it off, smile politely. For a while, it worked. He liked the solitude of the car, the feeling of movement, the brief interactions at doorsteps. But even there, the ghosts found him. A sudden horn, a slammed door, and his pulse spiked, hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. Once, a customer laughed when he stumbled over his words, her impatience cutting deeper than she realized. He drove away feeling invisible, like a shadow passing through the world, useful only so long as he carried someone else's dinner. What hurt most wasn't the failures themselves. It was the way people looked at him. The polite smiles, the nods, the way their eyes slid past him as if he were already fading. In uniform, people had saluted him, cheered, thanked him. Now, out of uniform, he was just another man struggling to keep up. He longed for someone to truly see him, not as a burden, not as damaged, but as a man with worth. He joined a job fair once, the kind held in a hotel ballroom with banners and recruiters behind neat tables. He walked the rows, shaking hands, collecting brochures. "Thank you for your service," they said again and again, as they handed him pamphlets for positions he wasn't qualified for, positions that paid less than what he needed to survive. He smiled, nodded, tucked the papers under his arm, but inside he was screaming. Did they see him at all, or just the word veteran stamped across his chest? One night, after another rejection letter, he sat at his kitchen table, the stack of bills staring back at him. He dropped his head into his hands. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the fridge. He thought of the men he had served with, of the lives cut short, of the way he had promised himself he would live for them. But what kind of life was this? Scrambling for scraps, dismissed, invisible. He clenched his fists until his knuckles ached. Still, he kept trying. Because that's what soldiers do. They try, they endure, they fight battles no one else can see. He picked up odd jobs, fixing fences for neighbours, mowing lawns, carrying boxes for people moving houses. The work was meagre, the pay smaller, but it kept him moving. He reminded himself that motion was better than stillness, that purpose, even in fragments, was better than none. Yet the feeling of invisibility never left him. Walking through town, he caught his reflection in shop windows and barely recognized the man staring back. He saw weariness in his eyes, shoulders bent under invisible weight. People passed him without a glance, their lives bright and bustling. He wondered if he had become a ghost in his own story. But in that darkness, a spark began to form. The thought was small, almost foolish, but it lingered. If no one would give him a place, maybe he could make his own. The idea flickered when he cooked simple meals in his kitchen, when he shared leftovers with neighbors who praised the flavor, when a fellow veteran at the VA said, "Man, if you opened a place, I'd eat there every day." The words struck deep. Maybe, just maybe, he could build something, not just for himself, but for others who felt as invisible as he did. It was only an idea then, fragile as paper. But it was more than he'd had in a long time, and for a man who had survived worse, an idea was enough to start. The night he made the promise to himself began like so many others, silent, heavy, endless. The apartment was dark except for the faint glow of the streetlight sneaking past the blinds. Bills sat on the table like soldiers in formation, lined up against him, demanding a fight he couldn't win. His boots rested by the door, polished out of habit though no one cared, and his medals remained in the drawer, invisible tokens of a past that seemed to matter only in memory. He sat in front of the cracked mirror that hung crooked on the wall above the bathroom sink. The glass was chipped at the corner, distorting the reflection just enough to make his own face look foreign. He leaned forward, studying the man who stared back. His eyes were hollow, ringed with sleepless nights, his jaw tight, his shoulders slumped. This was not the man who had once led others through fire, who had once carried brothers to safety under enemy fire, who had once stood unflinching in the face of chaos. This was a man fading, dissolving into invisibility. Anger burned in his chest, not the wild fury of combat, but the slow, suffocating fire of shame. Shame that he had allowed himself to be reduced to this. That he had let rejection define him, that he had believed the quiet dismissal of others. He thought of the restaurant again, the way the hostess had lifted her hand in refusal, the way the laughter inside had grown louder as he turned away. That moment had become a scar, one he touched every time he doubted his worth. But tonight, something shifted. As he stared into the mirror, his hands gripped the sink until his knuckles went white. He clenched his jaw, feeling the heat rise in his chest, and whispered, "No more." The words startled him, harsh in the quiet room. He said them again, louder this time, his reflection almost daring him to mean them. No more. The promise came slowly at first, then poured out of him, raw and unfiltered. He promised himself he would not be invisible. He promised he would not let the world erase him, not after all he had survived. He had endured deserts that swallowed men whole, nights when death was a breath away, losses that would have broken lesser souls. If he could survive that, he could survive this. More than that, he could build something out of it. He thought of the men he had lost, their faces sharp in his memory. The kid from Georgia with the crooked smile, the medic who sang softly under the stars, the sergeant who cracked jokes even with bullets flying. They hadn't come home. He had. What right did he have to squander that gift? No, he decided, he would live in a way that honored them. He would carve out a space where men like him, forgotten and dismissed, could find dignity again. The mirror reflected a man transformed, not because the weariness vanished, but because something older and stronger stirred beneath it. Determination, resilience, the will that had carried him through hell. He unclenched his fist and then tightened it again, testing the strength that remained. "You've been through worse," he told himself. "Get up. Keep going. Build something." For the first time in years, the path ahead felt less like a void and more like a mission. Missions he understood. Missions had steps, objectives, goals. He pulled out his battered notebook, the one filled with half-scribbled recipes and costs, and began to write with new purpose. He listed ingredients, not just for food, but for survival. He wrote down ideas for a place. A diner maybe, small but warm, where no one would ever be turned away. He imagined veterans sitting together, laughing, eating, remembered not for what they had lost, but for what they still had. The promise hardened into a plan as the night deepened. He would save what he could, work whatever jobs were necessary, cut every expense until he had enough to take the first step. He would learn what he didn't know: permits, licenses, suppliers. He would fight this new war with persistence instead of weapons, with grit instead of firepower. And when the world told him no, he would answer by creating his own yes. He closed the notebook and placed it on the table like a vow sealed in ink. Then he looked back at the cracked mirror. The face staring at him was still weary, still scarred, but now it carried something else: defiance, a refusal to fade away, a promise to himself and to the ghosts who still walked beside him. As he turned off the light and stepped into the quiet of his apartment, the words followed him, steady and sure. "I will not be forgotten. I will not be refused. I will build a place where we all belong." And with that, the veteran finally slept. Not peacefully, not without dreams, but with the certainty that tomorrow would be different because he had made it so. The idea began small, like a whisper he almost ignored. But whispers have a way of growing when you're ready to listen. He started in his own kitchen, the one-bedroom apartment barely big enough to hold a stove, a fridge, and a small table. The walls smelled faintly of old paint. The counter chipped, but it became his laboratory. He experimented late into the night, scribbling notes in his battered notebook. Chili that stuck to your ribs. Cornbread soft enough to melt. Coffee brewed strong, not fancy, but honest. Food had always been more than fuel. It was memory. It was the pot of stew that appeared in the barracks after a hard mission. It was the MRE traded for a chocolate bar that reminded a man of home. It was laughter over burnt toast when supplies ran low. Food meant survival, but it also meant connection. And he wanted to recreate that connection. He scraped together savings, took every odd job he could, and when it still wasn't enough, he sold the few things he owned of value. The guitar, the watch his father had given him. Painful sacrifices, but each one brought him closer. Finally, with a modest amount in hand and determination heavier than his doubts, he found a place, a small, run-down diner on the edge of town. Its sign was faded, one window cracked, the floor tiles chipped. To anyone else, it was nothing but a failing business waiting to be demolished. To him, it was a battlefield ready to be reclaimed. The landlord was skeptical. "You sure you want this place?" "It's been empty more often than it's been open." The veteran nodded. "I'm sure." What he didn't say was that he wasn't just opening a restaurant, he was building a sanctuary. The first days were brutal. He scrubbed floors until his hands blistered, painted walls until his shoulders ached, patched leaks in the roof, and fixed wobbly tables rescued from thrift stores. Alone in the empty diner, he worked with the same focus he had once used on missions overseas. Each nail hammered, each brushstroke, was another step in reclaiming his life. The smell of fresh paint replaced the mustiness. The old neon sign flickered back to life, and slowly, the diner began to resemble a place of welcome. He opened quietly. No fanfare, no advertising, just a hand-painted sign in the window. Open. The first customer was an older man who wandered in by chance, drawn by the smell of coffee. They spoke little, But the man ate his eggs, drank his coffee, and left a few crumpled bills on the counter with a nod that said more than words. The veteran watched him leave, his heart pounding. It was small, but it was a start. Word spread slowly. A truck driver stopped in one morning, hungry after a long haul, and left telling others on his CB radio. A pair of veterans from the local VA arrived one afternoon, drawn by curiosity, and found not just food, but understanding. They stayed for hours, swapping stories, their laughter filling the once empty room. "Feels like home," one of them said, and the veteran nearly broke down right there. The diner became more than a place to eat. It became a gathering point. He kept prices low, sometimes too low to cover costs, but he didn't care. What mattered was that no one walked away hungry. When a man short on cash tried to pay, he waved it off with a smile. "Pay me when you can. Or don't, just eat." He knew what it was to be hungry, not just for food, but for belonging. The walls began to tell stories. A faded American flag donated by a fellow veteran hung above the counter. Photos appeared, old black and white snapshots of men in uniform, letters folded into frames, medals tucked carefully into shadow boxes. Customers brought them, unasked, as if compelled to leave a piece of themselves behind. The diner was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone who walked through the door. Of course, there were challenges. Bills piled up. Equipment broke. Some days the diner was empty, and doubt crept in, whispering that he had made a mistake. But then a family would arrive, or a veteran would walk in with a friend, or a child would wave at him from a booth, and the doubt dissolved. Each meal served was a victory. Each smile proof that he was building something real. The veteran worked tirelessly, often from dawn until after midnight, but he didn't mind the exhaustion. This was a different kind of tired, one that came not from despair, but from purpose. He wore an apron instead of armor, carried trays instead of rifles, but in his heart it felt like a mission worth fighting for. Sometimes, late at night, when the diner was quiet and the lights dimmed, he sat at the counter with a cup of coffee, listening to the silence. It was not the heavy silence of nightmares, but the gentle quiet of peace earned through struggle. He looked around at the worn booths, the polished counter, the photos on the walls, and felt a pride deeper than he had ever imagined. He remembered his promise in front of the cracked mirror. "I will build something. I will not be forgotten." And here it was, taking shape around him. The diner was not just a building. It was resilience made visible, a promise kept. It was proof that even when the world turned you away, you could create a door of your own and open it wide. It didn't happen all at once. Success rarely does. It arrived in small, almost unremarkable waves. A new face at the counter, an extra pot of coffee emptied before noon, a regular who brought a friend who brought another. The bell over the door became a metronome for momentum, chiming with a rhythm that sounded like possibility. On a Tuesday that would have been forgettable a month earlier, the veteran looked up from the griddle to find every booth occupied, steam fogging the front windows as if the building itself were exhaling. He moved with the cadence he'd learned to trust. Flip, plate, pour, smile. The work stitched him into the room. Word of mouth carried farther than he imagined. Truckers traded directions over the radio. Nurses finishing night shifts texted each other pictures of biscuits split open and drowning in gravy. A teacher from the high school posted a photo of her class field trip. Teenagers lined up for pancakes, laughing under the American flag on the wall, and the post clicked and chimed its way across town. A young reporter from the local paper wandered in one morning, hair still damp from a rushed shower, notebook ready. She asked questions he wasn't sure how to answer. "What made you start this? What does this place mean to you?" And he did what he'd done since opening. He told the truth in simple sentences. "People are hungry," he said. "Some for food, some for something else. I can help with both." Her article ran on a Sunday above the fold, a photograph of him mid-pour, coffee arcing into a mug like a promise. The headline was plain: "A veteran opens a door." That was enough. By the following week, the line reached past the door and onto the sidewalk. The bell rang and rang again, and he found himself learning a new kind of logistics. How to keep the coffee hot without burning it. How many pounds of flour a morning consumes. How to read the room so you know when to slide into a riff of small talk and when to leave a quiet table alone. He learned the names that arrived every day. The iron worker who always asked for extra butter. The third shift cop who corralled laughter with 2 fingers and a grin. The widow who brought a framed photo of her husband in uniform and set it at the edge of her plate like an extra guest. He watched strangers become regulars, regulars become neighbours, neighbours become a kind of family that didn't ask many questions and answered even fewer, preferring the exchange of care to the exchange of information. With success came pressure. He learned that a griddle has moods and that stoves go on strike at exactly the wrong time. The first Saturday rush after the article, a burner sputtered and died, while tickets stacked like a deck he couldn't shuffle fast enough. He felt the old panic squeeze his lungs, that treacherous message from the body that says you are about to fail. He steadied himself the way he used to calm a patrol at dusk. One breath, then another, then the next necessary action. He spread the work, moved bacon to the flat top, transferred eggs to a smaller pan, pivoted, apologized with sincerity to the first table and with gratitude to the second. No one stormed out. People waited. People understood. And when the crisis passed, the room broke into a small, spontaneous applause that embarrassed him into a smile he couldn't hide. The wall over the counter evolved into a living scrapbook. New photos arrived with the people who carried them. A sailor at 19 in a hat too big for his head. A marine whose grin could start fights and end them. A nurse in fatigue standing on a tarmac the colour of iron. Someone brought a shadow box with dog tags and a ribbon the colour of wine and asked if he would hang it high enough to catch the morning light. He did. He added brass hooks below for anyone who wanted to leave a cap or a patch. Over time, the collection grew into a chorus. Colours and fabrics and frames that didn't match, but somehow belonged to each other. You could stand under that wall and feel time stack itself in layers, not heavy, but honest. Requests started arriving he hadn't thought to expect. A church asked if he'd cater breakfast for their volunteers painting a shelter. A union rep wondered if his guys could pick up trays before the sun rose for a highway project. A councilwoman floated the idea of a veterans table once a week. Free breakfast for anyone who'd served, no questions beyond, "How do you like your eggs?" He checked the numbers. They did not smile back. But the wall over the counter had taught him something about arithmetic they don't print in textbooks. What you spend on dignity gives better returns than any coupon ever will. He took a pen, circled a day, and wrote it on the board. Wednesdays, 7 to 10 a.m. Veterans eat free. The first week, 6 showed up. The second week, 11. By the fourth Wednesday, he pulled 2 extra tables out of the back and borrowed chairs from the bar next door. Laughter rose and remembered how. News travelled beyond the county. A regional morning show sent a cameraman and a host who practiced her smile between takes. She asked him to repeat a line about service, and he tried, but something about saying it twice made it feel false. So he told another truth instead. "I wasn't looking for attention," he said, wiping the counter with a towel that had seen better mornings. "I was looking for a place where you belong here. Shows up hot." The segment aired before sunrise. By lunch, strangers were hugging him like uncles and nieces. The attention made him uneasy. Fame is just a louder version of being watched, but he set the unease on a shelf and got back to the line. Some recognition came dressed as bureaucracy, and he met it with the same patience he'd learned in waiting rooms. The health inspector arrived unannounced with a clipboard and a posture that suggested she had seen things. He walked her through the kitchen like a tour he had practiced in his head. Temperatures logged, sanitizer mixed to the ounce, knives stored with blades turned. She found a minor violation, labels missing on 2 backup containers, and he corrected it while she was still writing the note. At the door, she glanced at the wall of photos and then at him. "My father served," she said, too quietly to make a statement, just loud enough to leave a connection. The score on the report posted near the register was a number no one could argue with. The line lengthened after that, as if people trusted a fraction more when numbers agreed with feelings. He began to hire, a verb that felt both terrifying and tender. A kid from the high school washed dishes after last period, sleeves rolled high, eyes wide with the kind of earnestness that makes you remember your first job. A single mom with forearms strong from laundry carts learned the register in 2 shifts and the regulars' names in 3. A Navy vet who hadn't yet found his footing came in for coffee, left with a part-time apron, and by the end of the week was calling tickets with a voice that made the kitchen move like choreography. He trained them the way he wished the world trained anyone: explain, demonstrate, watch carefully, praise specifically, correct privately. When mistakes happened, and they did, he wrote them down like weather, not like omens. Social media took what the bell over the door couldn't carry. Strangers posted photos of plates that told the story for him. Biscuits crated with gravy like small pale continents. Mugs, dark as midnight, held in hands that looked like they could fix a fence without measuring. Captions settled on a phrase nobody planned: "Come as you are." He didn't put it on the sign. He didn't have to. People arrived in work boots, in scrubs, in suits with ties loosened, in hoodies with sleeves chewed at the cuffs, in uniforms folded at the shoulder like a memory you can touch. They arrived tired, weepy, celebratory, numb. He handed them plates and let the room do the rest. Every success carried a soft echo of the man he used to be. Steady under pressure, watching the whole field, noticing the person in the corner who needed a check-in. He found himself moving around the diner like a quiet current. Fresh coffee here, a joke for the table that had gone too silent, a napkin slid toward a man whose hand had begun to shake. He didn't call it therapy or ministry or anything with syllables. He called it work, and it worked on him too. The restaurant that had turned him away existed only a mile down the same road, and some days a customer mentioned it. "You've shown them," someone would say, with the gleeful edge of team sports. He always smiled and changed the subject. Spite is a blade that cuts the hand that wields it. This place was built on other fuel. Still, one afternoon near closing, a woman in a suit came in, the kind of navy fabric that drinks light, the kind of posture that looks practiced. She ordered a coffee to go, black. She stood by the wall of photos, reading the little handwritten notes pinned below frames, the dates, the units, the jokes. When she reached the counter again, she set her cup down untouched. "I'm the manager at Silver Lantern," she said, naming the very restaurant that had refused him. "I didn't know." He felt something old stir in his ribs. He kept his hands still, kept his voice easy. "You know now." She swallowed, nodded once, and left the bill for the coffee on the counter, with a tip so large it misfired the arithmetic in his head. He tucked the cash into the jar labelled "Weds Vets" and flipped the sign to "Closed 5 minutes early," because sometimes a victory needs silence to land. Recognition rippled outward in less visible ways. A landlord who once eyed him like a temporary tenant replaced a faulty heater without an argument. A bank officer returned his call in an hour instead of a week. A city planner who ate pancakes on Thursdays slid a form across the counter with 3 sticky notes: highlights, deadlines, a phone number with her initials. Doors that had once felt sealed now gave a little when he leaned. On the first anniversary of opening, he didn't plan a celebration. He made biscuits like always, brewed coffee like always, wiped the counter with the towel that had frayed into softness. At 8 o'clock, the bell rang and kept ringing. People arriving with pies, with cards, with a framed print of the headline from that first Sunday paper. Someone hung balloons he hadn't asked for. The room sang a song it didn't quite know how to sing, voices overlapping, off-key and perfect. He stood there in an apron dusted with flour and tried to speak, then didn't. Instead, he lifted a mug and tapped it lightly with a spoon until the chatter quieted. "Thank you for letting me serve you," he said. The room answered not with applause, but with the sound of forks and laughter and chairs scraping closer. life proceeding, which was the best applause there is. When the day ended and the door latched behind the last lingering goodbye, he stood alone under the soft hum of the neon sign. The diner smelled like coffee and sugar and the faint clean of lemon cleaner, the scent of a day well used. He wiped the last table slowly, then looked at the wall of faces. Men and women younger than they'd ever be again, older than they had been allowed to become. "We're getting there," he said to them, to himself, to anyone listening. Outside, the town felt different, not because it had changed, but because a small room within it had. Success wasn't a trophy on a shelf. It was this: a line in the morning, a hush in the afternoon, the certainty that tomorrow people would show up hungry and leave less alone. And somewhere beneath the contentment, a new idea began to gather shape, quiet but persistent. He didn't name it yet. He didn't have to. It sounded, in the back of his mind, like hinges easing, like a lock remembering how to open. The idea started as a flicker, the kind of thought you dismiss the first time it comes. But flickers, if fed, can grow into flames. The diner was steady now, lines out the door on weekends, veterans' tables overflowing with laughter, families gathering like they belonged. He no longer woke each morning wondering if the day would collapse under its own weight. Instead, he asked himself what more could be done. And always, the answer circled back to the same place, the restaurant that had once turned him away. He passed it sometimes on delivery runs or errands, the silver lantern still glowing with golden light, its windows filled with well-dressed diners clinking glasses. For years, that building had been a scar, a reminder of humiliation. Now, it looked different. It looked like an opportunity. Not for revenge. He had learned that revenge only poisons the vessel that carries it, but for reclamation. If that door had once been closed to him, then perhaps it was his duty to open it wide for others. The chance came quietly. A banker he now counted as a friend mentioned it over coffee. "Heard the lantern's owner is retiring. Might be selling." The words settled into him like coordinates on a map. He spent nights running numbers, scribbling notes, pacing the kitchen long after closing. It was a risk, bigger than anything he'd attempted since walking into battle. But he had fought wars before. He could fight this one too. Negotiations stretched for weeks. Papers, signatures, meetings in offices that smelled of leather and ink. More than once he nearly walked away, convinced it was too much, too soon. But each time doubt crept in, he thought of that night outside the door, the sting of rejection, the laughter that had followed him into the dark. And he thought of the promise he had made to himself. No more. He would not be invisible. He would not be refused. The day the keys landed in his palm, he held them like medals. Cold metal, small enough to slip into a pocket, yet heavy with meaning. He walked to the Silver Lantern, his restaurant now, and paused at the door. The same door where he had once stood, hungry and dismissed. He pushed it open, and for the first time he didn't feel like an outsider. The air smelled the same, garlic butter, wine. But the weight of it shifted. This was no longer a place of exclusion. It was his, and he would decide what it became. Renovations came first. He stripped away the pretense, the stiff white tablecloths and overpriced menus, and replaced them with warmth. Wooden tables, sturdy and welcoming. Photos of veterans, the same kind that lined the walls of his diner, hung here too, so that no one could forget whose sacrifices made peace possible. He kept the chandeliers, though, letting them cast their golden light not on exclusivity, but on community. When the doors opened again, the town held its breath. Some came curious, some skeptical, some eager to see what he would do. What they found was simple. A menu of honest food, fair prices, and one bold promise written on the chalkboard above the counter. Free meals for veterans, always. The first Wednesday, a handful of veterans came. They ate quietly at first, unsure if it was real. By the next week, word had spread. Dozens arrived, Some in wheelchairs, some leaning on canes, some carrying scars no one could see. They filled the booths and tables, their laughter bouncing off the chandeliers, their stories weaving together across plates of chili, biscuits, and coffee. He moved among them, refilling cups, shaking hands, listening. One man gripped his arm, tears in his eyes. "No one's ever done this for us," he whispered. The veteran squeezed back. "You're home here." Recognition followed, louder than before. News crews came, cameras capturing the sight of veterans dining beneath golden light, served by a man who had once been denied at the same door. Headlines spoke of redemption, of dignity restored. But he didn't do it for headlines. He did it because the ghosts deserved it, because the living deserved it, because no one who had given so much should ever feel invisible again. Not everyone understood. Some critics muttered about charity cutting into profits, about foolish generosity. He let them talk. The registers balanced enough to keep the lights on, and the gratitude of his patrons was profit that no ledger could measure. He remembered something he had learned in the field. Resources matter, but morale wins wars. In his restaurant, morale was the currency, and it flowed freely. On the one-year anniversary of reopening, the place was packed. Veterans and civilians alike sat shoulder to shoulder, eating, talking, laughing. The air buzzed with life, the chandeliers glittered above, and the walls glowed with photos and flags. At the center of it all stood the veteran, apron tied at his waist, coffee pot in hand. A hush fell as someone raised a glass. "To the man who turned rejection into redemption," they said. The room erupted in cheers, glasses clinking, applause echoing. He bowed his head, humbled, his throat too tight to speak. Later that night, after the last table was cleared and the lights dimmed, he stood alone in the quiet. He walked to the door, the same door that had once closed on him, and laid a hand against it. "We did it," he whispered, not just to himself, but to every brother he had lost, to every ghost who still lingered. He imagined them sitting at the tables, laughing, eating, alive in memory. The promise he had made in front of the cracked mirror had been kept. He had built something. He had refused to be invisible. And now, when people asked what he did, he no longer stumbled. He looked them in the eye and said with quiet pride, "I feed people. I give them a place to belong." The war would always live inside him. The nightmares would never vanish completely. But here, in this place reclaimed from humiliation, he had found a different kind of victory. Not one of weapons or medals, but of doors opened, tables filled, lives touched. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even justice. It was something greater. It was redemption.